Alright, guys, this is the next episode of the Knight Rider in Universe build from MPC in 125th scale. We're going to take a look at the completed chassis with all the modifications I've made. Okay, and here we go. This is the in Universe build of Kit as I envision the car to be built as being a completely modified Trans Am. So everything's been changed, and this is the final version of the chassis after multiple redesigns that I have continued to alter. Let's see if I can give you guys a really good look at this. Here you can see the front suspension's done. You can see the turbine engine, the lower half of the casing of the turbine engine peeking out from under there. The front armored panel with radiator for cooling the turbine engine. Here we have the front suspension. One of the things that I modified on the front suspension was adding an aluminum sleeve to the front shock absorber spindle assembly. Gives it a little more of a realistic appearance of being an actual shock absorber, as opposed to just being the shaft that was sitting there. The vehicle does have posable steering, which, due to the placement of the turbine engine that I put in there, did cause me a few issues, as the sway bar of the front tie rod bar had to be mounted upside down because it wouldn't fit with the turbine engine in there. So instead of it curving upward, it should have been curving downward to make clearance for the sway bar, which I had to mount. Since I had to mount the tie rod bar, the steering linkage, upside down, the sway bar had to be moved from its connecting point here on the control arm to connecting here, because otherwise the bar wouldn't be able to turn for the pullable steering. So I just mounted the sway bar a little further forward, attached to the armored panel, and it's attached to the steering gear from under the control arm, from above the control arm instead of under the control arm where it was before. This, I feel, could have been a change that they made when they redesigned the entire front end of the car. And it still looks pretty good, so I'm happy with it. Here you can see all the armor plating that I placed under kit. The central spine, which covers all the cabling and electronics that are now loaded into the car, as it no longer has a drive shaft. Here we have more armored plating to protect the rear differential. And here we have one of the biggest departures from the original car. The rear differential is now an electric motor. This, I feel, makes more sense as it provides 100% of the torque to move the vehicle starting at 0 RPM. Here I've used some cabling that I've gotten from Tamiya, the steel braided cable, to simulate the high voltage lines leading to the electric motor. Then we have more wiring going to the motor, all coming from the nuclear power plant, which provides the electricity for the electric motor, the electric differential. That's what I'm going to call it. This is just my interpretation of how Kit puts the power to the ground. To achieve the speeds it achieves, this differential will be providing all the torque from the minute you touch the pedal, and kit will launch like a rocket. And speaking of rockets, if we look here, and this plating here contains the jump jets that kit uses when Michael hits turbo. And this interpretation has ducting coming from the turbine engine, which feeds these jets, and they fire as the car is rocketing and forward with the electric rear diff spinning. And as it's accelerating, these jets fire, and that's what launches kit into the air and makes for all those crazy stunts that kit could do on the show. So this is pretty much it for phase 1 of this kit. Took quite a while to get there as I redesigned the thing about 10 times trying to find a design that made me happy, and I think this is it. And I think it all fits into the universe of Knight Rider, as this Trans Am is now a super high-tech 200-mile-an-hour supercar. This is the part of the kit where I will make the biggest divergence from the original kit, and I like it. Now, let me point out a few things for those of you who want to build this kit. There are a couple of issues with assembling it. Number one is the rear shock absorbers. They mount, the bottom mount slides into the peg slides into the hole in the chassis, and then the top mount gets glued into the rear axle. The problem is that this top mount is too long, and if you position it into the axle as it is here, the shock absorber won't sit fully into the chassis here. So what I had to do was just shave down the lower portion of the top mount where it contacts the axle. Shave it down just like a millimeter or so, and that removed the excessive clearance and eliminated the gap so that the shock absorber sits fully into the chassis. Now, another thing, the rear springs. The instructions tell you to insert the, let's see if we can find it underneath all of this stuff here. The instructions are not very clear on how to insert it, whereas it tells you to assemble the two halves and insert into the body, and then or into the differential, into the axle. I found that doesn't really want to sit perfectly straight as you're trying to put it together. The easiest way I found to do it was first to use a slow setting glue and install the rear springs into the chassis. Now you're going to need the slow setting glue because you're going to have to make adjustments when you install the rear axle. Now you're going to put glue on the rear axle. You're going to put the slow setting glue here. Then you're going to position the rear axle into its mounting point here and onto the spring here. Now, you're not going to glue the rear axle down yet. What I found is that position the rear axle, it'll hold the springs in position because you're going to have to make a few adjustments and move things, or in my case, since I had to install all of these extra parts, trying to measure everything out with the springs and the axle holding everything together was just a disaster. So I glued the springs into the chassis. Then I placed the rear axle on a spring perch and into the body. and I just let it sit there holding the springs in their loaded position. And once the springs dried in the chassis, I could remove the rear axle and the spring stayed in the chassis, and then the axle just dropped right into position and everything was perfectly lined up. So that's my recommendation: is install the rear springs first into the chassis with a slow setting glue, put the axles in, which will allow you to move the springs into the proper position, and then just let it sit there till the springs dry in the chassis. Then you can remove the axle and do whatever you want to do. I hope that makes sense. And I think that's about it. That's the current setup of kit. Next, it's time to start on the body and the interior, which are both going to be loaded up with LEDs. All right, I'll see you on the next one. Oh, forgot one thing. The front springs. Again, the instructions, they tell you to install the springs into the chassis and then install the control arms on the springs. I actually found it easier to use, again, a slow setting glue, install the springs into the control arms, and then drop the control arm spring assembly onto the chassis, which would allow you to maneuver the spring into the perch in the chassis for the spring. And I found it easier to align the spring with the spring attached to the control arm instead of the chassis, because while you're putting that together, you're also holding in the spindle. And again, I found it easier to attach the spindle to the lower control arm, and then just slide the spindle into its mount, and then swing the control arm over and drop the spring into its perch, and then glue down the control arm on the 2 points there on the subframe. I found that to be the easiest method of installing the front suspension. Okay. Oh, and if you're wondering about the colors, I use Tamiya titanium silver, titanium gold, and bronze, and also Tamiya metallic gray for all the colors and the shading. All over Tamiya gray primer. All right, guys. That's it. See you on the next one.